Hey everyone, this is a clip from a recent episode of the Men of Steel podcast where we talk about Superman and Superman adjacent topics. If you enjoy this clip, check out the podcast. You can find it at certainpov.com or wherever you get your shows.
I remember when I was first getting very into the influence of the actual original creators and how much of characters were created by one force, but then a lot of what we knew about them and what we accept as the main qualities that make this character them came from later writers, later artists. With Wolverine, who really created Wolverine? Was it Len Wein? Or was it Len Wein and Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum? Was it Len Wein and Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum and John Byrne? Depending on what part of the canon that they added that we now think of as essential Wolverine, like, well, you can't have Wolverine without that element. And it was really interesting to me with Superman as I was getting more into it, how many things were still Jerry Siegel influence, because even after it was no longer exactly his baby, didn't belong to him and Joe Shuster anymore because they'd sold the rights and all that jazz. But he stuck with DC Comics and kept making all these later stories that added all these things to the mythology. So I kind of love that this first true exploration of the death of Superman and its impact comes from the guy who thought of it. And he got to be the guy to decide who would be the one to kill Superman. Would it be this big bone monster who comes out of nowhere and digs himself out of the ground because someone dropped him there and forgot about him? Or is it Lex Luthor?
Yeah, for a long time, I didn't process that this was written by Jerry Siegel. Because there's such a reputation of like, oh yeah, the Siegel and Shuster era, like the Golden Age Superman stuff. And then like, it was not as widely known that Siegel came back and like was writing well into the 60s and 70s.
Right.
Often because he was not credited as the writer on these books. Like if you look at the issue, there's no credits in the issue for who's working on it. Curt Swan, very obvious when he's working on a Superman book. Curt Swan looks like Curt Swan. If you're familiar with what a Curt Swan Superman looks like, you're like, oh yeah, that's a Curt Swan Superman. But it's harder to tell necessarily if you're not familiar with who the writer is, particularly because the writing style has evolved. There's a lot going on in this world. It's very cool seeing how Siegel, having created the character in the first place, has rolled with so many changes over the course of the 23 years since the creation of the character, 38 to 61. Yeah. Like, there have been so many parts of the canon added, like so many things that came from the radio show that have become super important at this point in the series, and so many things that were just sort of like weirdly emphasized or mutated over time to get to the state of the canon in 61 and to do a story that is like, this is the send-off for the Superman at this snapshot of a moment. Remember, if you like the clip, after you're done liking and subscribing, check out certainpov.com where you can find more episodes of the show as well as a ton of other great shows.